Okay, in case I haven't met you, my name's Nathan. As we said, I've joined the BRC fairly recently this year. In part of this compilation, I was working with Paul and Rick to compile the Eloise Atlas. You would have done the exercise now to show that it was primarily a geophysical discovery in the 1980s by BHP as a kind of a spate of discoveries in the area that included the team that discovered Cannington as well. Putting the data together for Eloise had been a little bit challenging because there's not all that much published about it. The initial work was done by Tim Baker in a PhD study from James Cook in the mid-1990s. Paul luckily had visited when he was part of Xstrata and had taken a whole series of photos, so a lot of the photos in here are credited to Paul Gale for that, and there's some really nice photos of the mineralisation. We're not blessed with a huge volume of data like coarse high logger at the moment. There is some high logger being carried out at the moment from some of these drill holes, and that will eventually be incorporated into an update. But for now, I'll just kind of give a brief overview of what's going to be in the Atlas. You, of course, have these files on your USBs. And they complement the Geoscience Analyst database program as well that you have as well. Essentially, Eloise is a copper, gold, silver mine. It's always been an underground mine. It's buried below up to 30 or 40 meters of cover. And the depth of mining is currently at about 1,000 meters or slightly more. Again, we haven't really got finalized values or numbers on that. One thing you'll notice about the mag interp that you're doing is that there's these very highly elongate features, and Eloise very much follows some of those structural features as well. So we end up with a mineralized body that's extremely elongated, a few pods of mineralization split through a whole range of different ore lenses. The dimensions of each lode are fairly narrow, so somewhere between 2 to 10 meters in most instances, but certainly with some quite considerable strike length. And one thing that you'll notice when you open up the Geoscience Analyst is a huge plunging ore body, which is the initial discovery by BHP, and then further work by the companies following that have actually found that mineralization continues quite extensively to depth, but it has a very distinct southerly plunge as well. So the ownership of the deposit changed hands pretty quick. BHP walked away in the early 90s and sold to Amlig Resources. They managed to mine a fair amount of the deposit as well before Breakaway Resources took over. You can obviously extract a lot of this information from the Atlas itself. But I think in terms of some recent estimates, you can see here that some of the reserve estimates were somewhere between 2.3 million tonnes at about 2% copper. Paul showed a nice graph yesterday that put Eloise quite high up onto that binary plot of gold versus copper, so it was quite a high grade but very low tonnage, so it's kind of quite a bespoke mining operation really. And currently, as far as I can read, it's always been running on a 2-year mine life as well, so they're kind of constantly trying to replenish those reserves as they're doing exploration and resource drilling. But in total, probably about 50,000 tonnes of copper have been extracted from Eloise, the Eloise deposit. Rick's provided some regional setting. The mine host rocks are hosted by the Mount Norma quartzite. And you can see there's clearly a trend through some of these atlases to try and keep some standard. You can see the Eloise deposit located over here, and Osborne down here as well. So you can see the regional setting. These are the cover rocks that cover the eastern side of the craton. So highlighting that it was obviously a blind discovery back in the 1980s. In the atlas, you'll find a list of the ore lenses and lodes. These are some of the lodes that were from published reports and published documents. And the current owners, FMR Investments, have actually been really quite helpful, provide us with a lot of wireframes, and from those wireframes we've been able to extract some of the geometric features from them. The one thing you probably notice is that there's a very pronounced northeast strike to all of these lenses. When you look back at your mag interp, you'll see those long elongations coming out, and from that second target that Rick highlighted, you'll see some structural shoots going off towards the northeast, and that's the location of the Eloise deposit. And this is the location here in the mag. The host rocks are amphibolites and meta-arkose units, and you can see that on a planned geology map, which I'll show a little bit later on. There tends to be two major lodes within the system. There's the initial Elrose Levuka discovery, which is in the eastern side, and then the western ore bodies of slightly lower grade series of larger but lower grade lenses. Table 7.2 here shows those western lenses. This is the regional map, and you can see the underlying geology below that mag interp that you're looking at now, and these are the these are the lines that Rick painstakingly drew over the top of the mag interp. So you can compare your interp to Rick's interp here, but you can see the location of Eloise, the Altia lead zinc system, and down here in the Jericho system. So if you look now again against your mag map, you will see those Jericho systems is quite elusive actually, it's quite difficult to pick. As we go through, you'll see there are no reported granitoids in the area. There's obviously the intrusion of the Williams batholith off to the northeast up here, but there's no strict relationship between granites and the actual mineralisation observed at Eloise. Amphibilites form a major part of the regional stratigraphy, but also in the mine stratigraphy as well. So we'll move down, I'll quickly move down, I'll skip past some of the geophysics which we've seen. This is the structural interp from Tim Baker's thesis projected onto the total magnetic intensity map. So you can start seeing some of those shear zones that are running through the centre of the map, and then a zone of complexity up here as these shear zones, the Eloise, the Scrubby Creek, and the southern shear zone tend to converge. So it seems to be these zones of complexity that have helped localise the mineralisation at Eloise. Jericho down here again is sitting in what seems to be a relative mag low, but it's clearly not completely a mag low. This is Tim Baker's original geology map. So it was based on a limited amount of drilling that was done by BHP at the time and cross-sections through the base. So these cross-sections are going systematically through the south to the north of the deposit as we move this way. The major unit through here is the amphibolite unit, and this is the Eloise and Levuka lodes, which are located in what we call the eastern zone. And you can see from Tim's legend here, there's actually strong alteration surrounding those lodes. Whilst it's strong alteration, it's lithologically controlled and it doesn't extend for a huge distance away from the actual lodes themselves. So the geochemical footprint of these targets are actually quite small. At that time, the eastern lodes were fairly poorly described. They obviously weren't the major focus of the exploration drilling or the resource drilling at the time. And then as we move in later, I'll show you some of the actual more recent developments that have shown that some of these western lodes are actually quite extensive, albeit slightly lower grade as well. Another report or publication that came out was Hodkinson. This was basically an update on the geology by the AMLIG geology group. And they show some of the structural features much more clearly as well. So you can see the Levuka and Elrose lodes up here on the northeast. The major fault being the median fault that seems to be truncating the lower part of that system, and then the middle fault across here. Obviously the mine geologists have managed to extrapolate a huge amount of faults through there, and you'll find in the geoscience analyst database that there's a huge amount of faults in there, but some of the key ones that you can pull out are highlighted here, and we'll look at those in the geoscience analyst database a little bit later on. So this was released in 2003, and by that time they'd highlighted that these western lodes were fairly extensive and a lot more extensive than the original work by Tim Baker. But again, you can see this central amphibolite zone through here, and then the western and eastern arenites on both sides, and then a slightly higher grade metamorphic zone on the far east. So in terms of the geoscience analyst database or sister compilation, you can see these are the ore shells defined by FMR resources now, projected over the top of the 2003 Hodkinson geological map. And we can see this very good correlation with the ore lens. This is a 1% copper shell that we extrapolated in Leapfrog. You can't really get a sense of it, but this ore lens is plunging very, very, very steeply towards the south. So one of the things I recommend when you open up geoscience analysts is just have a good look around that ore lens and get a sense for the strike and plunge of that ore lens. The western lodes are located over here, and they've been segregated into Macy, Middle West, and Emerson. And again, they're very steeply plunging, fairly thin lenses of slightly lower grade. So you can see that the 1% copper shell doesn't actually incorporate a lot of those lenses, so they're probably sub-economic at best. And then just an example here of some of those faults that we saw from the earlier map. You can see the median fault, northwest striking structure, again here, and it truncates part of the ore body, and the middle fault that causes a little bit of offset towards the northwest. The southern fault is a more regional structure that was identified by Tim Baker as well, which was also interpreted as a shear zone, but they've managed to map that in there as a northwest trending structure as well. Going into 3D, you can see the vertical extent of some of these lenses. The base of this ore shell is at below 850 meters. Ground level is about plus 200, so you can see there's a good 1,000 meters of mineralized ore lenses through there. And you can see again the structural superposition of those faults. There's a few extra faults in here that you can see in the geoscience analyst fault compendium that shows the orientation of the major structures in the district as well. Rick's got a little exercise a bit later on that's going to try and help tease out some of that structural information as well into a little bit of an exercise. The structures are very much related to that D2, D3 brittle to ductile, ductile to brittle transformation, so very much controlled by the major structures through the eyes and orogeny. The mineralization itself is typically lenses of almost massive sulfide. Chalcopyrite is the main ore mineral. There's very rare documentation of anything other than chalcopyrite, but also in there is, as Rick mentioned, the northern zone of pyrrhotite-rich alteration or intergrowth with the chalcopyrite, and then a more southern magnetite-rich zone. The alteration is very lithologically dependent as well, so as you move into the amphibolites, the regional albitic alteration affected a large proportion of those rocks, but as you move into the shists have been overprinted by more mafic overprint, and from Tim Baker's paragenetic association here, these broadly correspond with stage 3, which was the main mineralization event, which saw the introduction of the chalcopyrite, the pyrites and pyrite as well, but really an overprint of any primary mafic phases by hornblende and biotite as well. The original albite alteration is largely destroyed, but you do see remnants of that preserved in the amphibolite, and we have a data set that hopefully alludes to some of that data being preserved. These are examples of the mineralization. These were taken by Paul Gow during his field trip back into the early 2000s, and you get a sense of the massive nature of these mineralization styles. So you can see that the lenses themselves are pretty much almost up to 90 or more % massive sulfide. Some complexity in the early veining that's been refolded as well, and mineralization has come in post-dating that as well. In terms of exploration geochemistry, the deposit was obviously blind to the surface. There was a sampling campaign during the the geochemical toolkit compendium by Hannon. We've included that data, and we're going to do a little exercise where we bring that data in, but we're just going to bear in mind that that was a surface soil sampling campaign over the top of a blind deposit during a period when the mine was in care and maintenance. So we'll digest some of that data and see the relevance a little bit later on. But in terms of lithogeochemistry, a lot of the data that we were provided was collected back in the day when there were 3 or 4 elements assayed. So we don't have a huge multi-element geochemical database in order to do any serious lithogeochemistry. An initiative that's being carried out at the moment by the Geological Survey is to use a TrueScan automated XRF analyzer to scan certain cores from around Mount Isa, and there are 4 drill cores provided by Eloise to the survey for that, and we've got very, very preliminary data that we can show you at the moment, and that data again will probably end up being refined and improved, but for the exercise today I think it's nice just to have something to at least have a look at and see if we can pull out some major geological trends from those, and we'll do that in one of the exercises a little bit later on. These are examples of the mineralization from the Levuka lode, and you can see the really nice intergrowths of the coarse chalcopyrite, the pyrrhotite, and the mafic alteration of the schists through there. From the western lenses, I mentioned that they're much lower grade, and you can get a sense of that from some of the alteration. The top image here shows that residual regional albitic alteration with localized overprint by more mafic alteration minerals, and a more disseminated style of mineralization. So you get a sense that these ore lenses are much less responsive in the geophysics and also much lower grade overall. This was an example of just the available lithogeochemistry that came from Tim Baker's thesis. This is a strip log just showing the amphibolite unit through here, the median fault that we saw on the plan map, schist units or the metararchos, and then the quartz biotite schist down the base here, and then a brief alteration legend as well. You get a sense that the albitic alteration is largely preserved in the amphibolite, but mostly destroyed as you move into the schists. You can see these black zones highlight the ore zone, and you can see the change in major element geochemistry as we move across those zones. Sometimes the ore lenses are accompanied by some calcite, and you can see that here in the kick in the calcite, but it's not always the case. So even here during the Alrose and the Levuka lenses, we don't see a significant rise in carbonate. So it's not always it's not as discriminatable in the geochemistry. But as I mentioned, some of these drill holes are going to be high logged, and that's something that, as you've seen from some of the data sets you were playing with earlier, the high log is really powerful at discriminating a lot of these alteration mineral styles. Okay, in terms of relative timing, Tim did a fair bit of geochronology, and as far as I know, that's the only geochronology that's available from the deposit at the moment. So his approximate age dates, based mostly on argon dating, are about 155 plus or minus 4 million years for the early biotite, which is pre-mineralization. The mineralization stage was roughly dated about 1,530 million years, so picking that up into the kind of the D3 timing. There's a little bit of geochemical data here, and I'll show you the strip logs first, which are from the TrueScan XRF analyzer. You can see on the right-hand side the assay from the mine site. You can see the grey bars are where they didn't assay, and the red bars are obviously the assay results. These are largely 1 to 2 meter composites. The XRF data that's taken from the TrueScan is measured on a much higher resolution, at a minimum probably 10 centimeter intervals. But for comparison to the assay data, we've actually had this composited to 1 meter intervals. And you get a sense that looking at the major element geochemistry through these holes, we see big variability in aluminium and sodium, which seems to be reflecting that albite alteration that's being preserved over here in the amphibolites. That tailors off as we move into the meta-arenites. So we're obviously seeing the destruction of the albitic alteration or non-preferential alteration of the arenites in the first place by the regional sodic alteration. Some of the characteristics of the ore lenses that we didn't see from the assay data that was provided by the company is obviously the elevated copper and the sulfur we'd expect, the iron that correlates with the chalcopyrite, and also the pyrite and pyrrhotite in those ore lenses. But we see elevated lead and arsenic in the ore lodes as well. There's probably about 50 elements that have come from the TrueScan analyzer, so we actually see increases in uranium as well, which is to be expected into those ore lenses. But you can see we're kind of in a predicament. We're trying to cross-correlate the TrueScan back to some ground truthing data, and we've only got 3 elements here from the assay, so there's a little bit of work to be done just to verify some of those elements. But in general, it seems to be a very quick way to get some robust geochemical, lithogeochemical data from existing drill holes. Paul introduced these images in the Osborne Atlas. These are the TEMA images, is basically equivalent of an MLA or a QuemScan, whichever people are using these days. And these really show on a very high resolution level the textural variability of the ore lenses and some of the alteration zones. So again, you can go through these in your own time, but you get a sense that you can see certain phases. And we can look at these in the geoscience analyst actually plotted down hole, but you can see the microcline or the K-feldspar rich alteration close to the ore lenses, the amphibolite or the amphibole rich alteration, which is probably the mafic overprint. I think from memory there was either fluorite or apatite in one of these pink phases, so, or gypsum. So again, we see that kind of trend similar to Ernest Henry, where you see the sulfates being introduced into the system. A lot of the fabric is preserved, so this is selective replacement of the schist by microcline, and as we go down we move into some of the more massive ore textures. So from the BSE image we can see we're dealing with the ore phases, and these are largely massive chalcopyrite, pyrite and pyrrhotite, and again a close association with calcite into those ore lenses as well. The final part of the atlas really just discusses the exploration history and the discovery. So this is from the Bresciani paper from 1992, which really documents the BHP team and their exploration success in the region. For the geophysicists among you, you've probably already read the paper. For non-geophysicists like me, it's quite a steep learning curve, but in any case, they're obviously not dealing with the processed images that we had for our exercise, and they're making a lot of interpretation based on the magnetic data that they had from airborne and then follow-up ground TEM surveys as well. If you do have questions or comments, I certainly would consider you direct those towards Rick, I think, and Paul, certainly much more experienced in these. But I guess the idea is really just from an initial aerial survey followed up by ground survey. This system and also other systems in the region were really well discovered, and you can integrate these data very well. So from the earlier stages, it wasn't kind of the most obvious anomaly, but it took quite a lot of careful interpretation of the data to actually see the Eloise surface expression through the cover rocks there. And then as they started drilling some exploration holes and doing some downhole TEM, the location of the ore lens became much more obvious. So I think it's a really good exploration success story that everybody likes to hear. I'm not going to dwell too much more. I think you can go through the geophysics and the atlas in your own time. The exercises that we have are going to follow on, and in terms of the genetic model, obviously we're kind of looking into the ISCG style of deposit, but there seems to be an extremely structurally related history to this deposit, and I think that's one of the exercises that we're going to try and help you sort of unravel as we go through with Rick. So I think I'm sort of conscious that we're standing between you and the beer and afternoon drinks, so I think we'll see how we go from there. I don't think Rick made a big enough plug, but in case anybody hasn't seen the atlases, you've told people where the atlases are, but all of the atlases that have been done and the ones that will be updated in this series are freely available on the UQ BRC website. So there's the atlas and the geoscience analyst data packs for every single atlas.
Yeah, not the ones we've done today, but hopefully they'll be up soon.
Sure. Okay. All right. Do you need this? Are you going to